Great. Okay. Well, thank you. It's a real thrill to be able to come and give this presentation because, as Jill was saying, it's a pretty new project for us. And because of the pandemic, I kind of put it to one side because we haven't necessarily started yet. We won it back in January, but then everything got put on hold and I almost forgot about it. So it's been really nice to be able to pull out some slides and start staring at stuff. But because the project hasn't happened yet, we don't have a huge amount of data, but I've scrabbled together to a few different kinds of results so that you can see some of the things that at least we've piloted. So the project is from Feed the Birds to Do Not Feed the Animals. Let me tell you a little bit about it first of all. It is a Wellcome Trust funded project, and actually the website has just gone live. So if you look up animalsfeeding.org, you'll be able to see our website, and there's a bit more information about it up there. Most of the time up until now, we've been using our Twitter account, which is at @animal_feeding, where we've been publicizing the jobs that are available and all of those sorts of things. So there's some information about it there. In terms of the team, this is the core team. This was actually a photograph that we took just before we went into pitch to the Wellcome Trust for the money. And you can, I think, see in Gary, who's the gentleman right at the front, the terror in his eyes. He's trying to look strong, but actually is pretty terrified. So the team is, from left to right, Angela Cassidy, who is in social sciences. So she's part history and part kind of STEM history as well, and does quite a lot of work on badger culling and things like that, works with rural policy and affairs. That's me just to her left. And then Gary Marvin is an anthropologist. He's the first professor of human animal studies. So he brings in the anthropology from a kind of animal studies perspective. Andrew Kitchener is from the National Museum of Scotland, National Museums Scotland rather, and is the curator of vertebrate, the collections there, and also very interested in zoos and zoo animals. And then just peeking into shot is Stuart Black from the University of Reading. So that's the core team, and we're just in the process right now of appointing all of the postdocs and the PhDs. We have one postdoc currently in place, so that's Virginia there, and then we've got another few that we're going to be appointing. I think most of the opportunities are now closed, but we're at interviewing stage, so you can watch this space for any of the new people who are going to be arriving. But what I would say is that whilst we have these particular positions that we're recruiting for, we've also been liaising with lots of other people, potential PhD students and potential postdocs, just to work up ideas and projects that might be mutually beneficial, and see if we can't fund little pilot studies for people who want to do their own projects. So if that's something that you're interested in, or if there are people that you know might be interested in that, do tell them to get in touch with us, because you know we want to spread the love a bit in terms of this project and support other people as well as supporting it ourselves. So that's the core team, but we are surrounded by a very large research network of invested researchers, and they span history, archaeology, veterinary science, ecologists, we've got geneticists, quite a lot of collections managers and curators, because we're working with a lot of national and local museums as part of this project. But let me perhaps tell you a little bit more about what this project is about. So as the title reveals, from Feed the Birds to Do Not Feed the Animals, it's all about animal feeding and whether we should or shouldn't be doing it. So I want to just take you through some of the pictures on here. So on the left, the day that we pressed submit on the grant, I went into town to buy a sort of celebratory big issue, and I was chatting to this guy, this big issue vendor, who coincidentally also feeds the birds. And I had a chat with him about what the birds mean to him, and he was telling me that they are his friends and he hangs out with them for companionship. And just in that moment, I thought this was a really sort of beautiful vignette of what this project represents in terms of human animal studies, but also kind of, yeah, it represents the project writ large, really, because when we look at what's happening in this scene, we've got a homeless man who is feeding feral pigeons, and they're both finding real companionship in each other. But the city of Exeter doesn't want either of them, right? They don't want us feeding either the homeless people or the feral pigeons. What instead we're encouraged to do, I would say, as a society, is feed the respectable garden birds. You know, we're not encouraged to feed feral things, do not feed the birds, but we can feed those in our gardens. And I have to say that over lockdown, for me, feeding birds has been a joy. Seeing them hopping around in the garden makes you feel as though everything is right in the world. And I think I'm not the only one who feels that, because we were looking at some of the research around bird feeding. There's actually now more bird feed going into the environment than there are birds to eat it. That's our love of bird feeding, to the extent that there aren't enough birds to consume everything that we're putting out there, which has implications for environmental health. And of course, when you're setting up a feeding station for a bird, you are often setting up feeding stations for cats as well, which is another part of the project that we're interested in looking at, is cats, because of course the domestic cat is not native to Britain. And when we bring new species in that rely upon us for food, we've got that kind of thing to think about as well. What are the consequences of us feeding pets? And that says nothing about the native cat as well, because, you know, what's the relationship between those domestic cats and the Scottish wildcat, which is functionally extinct in the wild now. They are entirely dependent on captive breeding programs, and then those cats are kind of released into the wild, so that there's this kind of ongoing conveyor belt of wildcats that are being reintroduced. But they themselves then have to go through quite a lot of training so that they know how to transition from being provisioned with food out to being able to gather it themselves. And that's within generally zoo settings, which then takes us to the other sort of area that we're looking at, which is zoos. You know, you all know the saying, do not feed the animals. But it's kind of contradictory, because on the one hand, when we're in zoos, we're told that we shouldn't feed the animals. And yet very often within zoos, they feed you, they give you, they allow you to buy food so that you can go and feed the animals. So it's like contradictory advice in every kind of way. We don't know what we should be feeding, shouldn't be feeding, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And so it was really all of this contradictory ideas and what are the unintended consequences of everything that we do that led to this project. So our research questions are: what are the histories and consequences of animal feeding for human, animal, and environmental health and well-being? What has driven and continues to drive these animal feeding practices? Because I love feeding animals just because it makes me feel as I'm connecting to nature, but there are lots of different reasons why people do so. And if we can do a sort of cross-cultural analysis to understand the drivers, then maybe when we start to answer question 1 and 2, that might allow us to kind of leverage that information to answer our third question, which is how can we use those data to enhance the future of human, animal, and environmental health? So those are the 3 sort of driving questions, and in some ways they're quite nicely summed up by this sign, where it explains what the problems of feeding the birds or very often other animals are, that it can result in, 1, non-migration of migratory species. It can result in overpopulation, which can cause physical damage to the physical environment. It can affect the environment in terms of pollutants that can then result in public health issues. And when I look at that infographic there, it also makes me think that quite a few of the things that are mentioned on there are also things that are kind of used often when we talk about domestication as well, that, you know, we have situations of animals no longer kind of migrating, and the populations increase that can often result in health conditions both for the animals and for humans as well. And so part of me started to think, and I think the rest of the team as well, is that are we actually looking at an acceleration of domestication, that by feeding all of these animals, we're essentially not only perpetuating this kind of domestication of wild animals, but really, really accelerating it, which does have consequences if we think more broadly about the way domestication has been framed, which it's always seen as being something that happened a long, long time ago. So over on the left graph here, we've got all of the different pathways to domestication and where they're considered to to have taken place. So really our project is looking at commensalism, I suppose, domestication through the commensal pathway, which if you look at this graph, the current documentation would suggest that commensalism, that pathway to domestication, kind of petered out about 2,000 years ago, and that other kinds of pathways to domestication took place. But I think our hypothesis is maybe that this commensal pathway to domestication is continuing and is perhaps accelerating. And if you remember back to Zoyner, when he was talking about domestication, he said that, the final stage of domestication is actually extinction, which we've seen happening with many, many different species. And when you look at the graph on the right, you can see that indeed the kind of hockey stick of extinctions is taking place really quite rapidly. And, can we start to see a correlation that is meaningful in terms of this increase in domestication and this increase in domestication? So that extinction, so that's one of the things that we also want to be looking at. But these are big issues that we're talking about. We can't be looking at all animal feeding everywhere on the planet from the deep past right up to the present. So we had to give ourselves some constraints. So what we're doing, although we're doing a big survey globally about the drivers of animal feeding, in general, we are going to be focusing on Britain, and we're going to be looking at 4 main foci, and they are these blue circles. So we're going to be looking at pets, so particularly domestic cats and things like fancy pigeons, but for some people, garden birds are conceptually their pets. We're going to be looking at pests, so feral cats and feral pigeons. We want to be looking at wildlife, so things like wild cats, but also big cats in the wild. So of course, that's going to take us to different continents, and also pigeons, so wild pigeons, and zoo life as well. So again, wild cats, big cats, and pigeons. So by having these constraints, it kind of allows us to focus on other things like animal health and feed industries and environmental health, and comparing health in these different kinds of settings. But of course, many of the animals that we're going to be looking at actually occupy all of these focal areas. So a pigeon, for instance, can occupy pests, wildlife, and zoo life. So by looking at particular kind of taxa in all of these settings, it allows us to explore the processes of domestication in current time, but also those processes of fertilization as well, which I think are not so well researched. So let's move then to these 3 settings that we're going to be looking at primarily, which is bird feeding and then cat feeding, and then later on the zoo feeding. Let's think about bird feeding, past, present, and future. We feed garden birds, but there are lots of other reasons why birds might end up being fed. And I've just got some images here that you might have sacrificial feeding of birds, or excarnation processes where sacred birds would come in to eat human corpses. So they're eating us. That's how we're feeding them. There can be ritual feeding for, could be for ornithomancy or as auguries, or in the case here in the middle, you can see that there's ritual feeding of black kites in Delhi. So it's part of the Muslim faith to be philanthropic, and it's the easiest way in a big city of being philanthropic is to ritually feed the black kites, and that's why there is a huge population of black kites in Delhi. But there can be other cases of feeding as well, such as raptors for hawking, or birds that are like doves, semi-domesticated birds, and then of course the feral pigeons as well. So there are lots of reasons that we might do it, but can we find archaeological evidence of it? So I just wanted to throw together some data that we were playing with, and one of them is Iron Age corvids. And in fact, I was talking to Dale remotely, thank you for your email, Dale, about that. I was about to email you back around this concept of, can we start to look at these corvids in a slightly different way? We know that we've got this kind of corvid event horizon from the work of Dale and Jim, where you can look in the Neolithic and in the Bronze Age, no corvids, and then you hit the Iron Age and suddenly there's corvids all over the place, often as complete skeletons. Is there something going on here where these are perhaps moving into a commensal relationship with humans? And a lot of the early isotope work that's been pulled together, often because there is an associated bone group on a site, if they're looking at Winnell Down, which is the isotope graph that I've got here, because it's a complete skeleton, they might just take a sample just to get background data so that we can better understand the human diet on the site. But I was looking at Jay and Richard's work about Winnell Down, and they do indeed have a raven in their collection that they did stable isotope analysis for, and that's the black circle that I've got here. And you can see that it plots in with the humans from that site and the dogs from that site. And if we were just looking at the dogs, we would be saying, okay, there's some commensalism going on here because the humans and the dogs often eat together. But I wonder if perhaps we're seeing something similar happening with the ravens as well. So perhaps that's something that we can look into to try to unpick what is going on in this period. Another example that we've got slightly more data from as a result of our chicken project that was running over the last few years is about sacred chickens and ritual feeding, because we did manage to get quite a lot of chickens from the Uli shrine and also one of the Mithraeum shrines in Belgium. And we knew that we had lots and lots of chickens, lots and lots of cockerels from these sites. And we know from the texts that often chickens were ritually fed for reasons of divination and all sorts of things. And so I've been liaising recently with a classicist. She's absolutely awesome. She's called Ash Green, and she's just finished up her PhD looking at chickens from a classics perspective, in particular ritual feeding. And I asked her, when I was looking at some of the isotope data that we gathered just from the project without really intentionally going and looking for this, I was like, is it possible that these chickens would have been ritually fed? And she was like, yeah, they definitely were. They had to be ritually fed, and were often fed with lentils, millet, and chickpeas. And of course, millet in particular is a plant species that has a very particular kind of isotopic signature. And I just wanted to show you this graph. This up here shows all of the data that we have for Roman chickens, primarily in Britain, but we've got a little bit of Belgium in there as well. And these open circles are from an Austrian site, 7th century, so not Roman, but we know that it was a site where there was a lot of millet being fed to chickens. And you can see that all of those open circles are the chickens that were fed millet. What we did, and this is just a kind of eye of faith graph more than anything else, if you look at when we've split the chickens according to domestic context that we've recovered them from and ritual context that we've recovered those chickens from, you should be able to see that some of those red dots are very much moving in the direction of millet-fed chickens. And I wonder if we're starting to pick up evidence, isotopic evidence, for this ritual feeding of chickens in the past. And I think that's something that we really want to push forward with as part of this project. And bring that right the way up to the present. So the main taxa that we're going to be looking at is actually pigeons, so that we can get a baseline from, say, the Roman period right up to the present day to see how diets have changed and what that looks like in terms of morphology on the bones as well, so that we can then start to have more of an informed set of guidelines about whether it is good or bad to feed birds and what it might do to their skeletons and their behavior. And I think that this one is quite a good example where we're looking at feeding swans, where I think a lot of people just in Exeter will take bread down to feed the swans. And a few years back, people got very, very concerned about this, to the extent that there was a big drive to no longer feed ducks or swans bread, because there was a suggestion that it was doing the birds a lot of damage to their health, that it was damaging the environment. And so there was a big drive called Bin the Bread, so that people stopped feeding these birds bread. And then the net result was that all of the birds started to die of starvation because they become so reliant on humans. So, we want to drill down into this as well to see what is the right pathway in terms of this kind of bird feeding. So let's now move on to cat feeding. So we talked about this right at the beginning of the presentation, that we have this species that has been brought to Britain. We still aren't entirely sure when that happened, although we have a project exploring that too. But what has been the consequence of bringing this new species to Britain and looking after it and caring for it? And of course, cats are now family members, but they require to be fed too. So what has been the consequences of our loving household cats? A few of you will have no doubt heard me talk about this before, because for a while I've been wrestling with this idea of when did we decide to start feeding cats fish, because this is not part of a cat's natural diet. They don't go rowing out to sea to haul in a catch of fish and eat it. So why do we have this association between cats and fish? We figured that this was something that we could actually investigate from an archaeological perspective using stable isotope analysis that might get us to an understanding of how that connection kind of came about, and then also whether it's a really useful connection to have, because, you know, I've mentioned before in talks that when we're buying fish for our own dinner, we always make sure that it's sustainably sourced. But when it comes to cat food, like, no one cares at all. So long as it's ground up and is in a box with a nice cat on the front, we don't care. And in fact, it's one of the drivers of overfishing of the seas is the pet food industry rather than the human fish consumption industry. So that's one of the things that we wanted to look at by using stable isotope analysis. And we've got some data now, and we've got more data coming. And if we imagine that -20 is generally the kind of divider between there being more marine protein in the diet and less, we were able to see that actually there's not much evidence of cats eating fish in the Iron Age, perhaps a little more in the Roman period, but it's in the Anglo-Saxon period, and particularly on monastic houses. So you can see all of these blue markers are ones that we know are from religious houses, where we start to see this connection with fish, which is really interesting given the rest of much of Anglo-Saxon diet did not have large amounts of fish in. So the fact that we've got the highest kind of signatures of fish consumption in monastic cats is quite interesting, and that it kind of continues through to the present day. As I said, we've got more data that will be coming on this that includes more isotopes as well, sulfur and hydrogen, that will really help us tease apart what is marine food rather than, I don't know, if a cat had eaten a mouse that had eaten millet, that could change up its signatures. So that's one of the things that we wanted to look at. And I think we're pretty convinced that this is an association that starts with monasteries where cats are, I'm just going to admit Kevin Riley, who's just arrived. So that, yeah, cats are kept by monks who want the cats to eat the mice that eat their documents. So it's kind of a useful thing. And then, of course, we know that the monks were also eating a lot of fish due to fasting regulations. And I think if we look at David Orton's work and James Barrett's work, we can see that there is this big upkick in marine fish consumption around the time that we start to see an upkick in fasting regulations as well. So there is that connection that's taking place. So that was one of the things that we wanted to explore, but there are other reasons as well. So what this slide shows, it's kind of multicolored hideousness. It's one of my students' projects. We wanted to explore how these changes in diet, together with changes in genetics, might have affected cat size through time. And the problem with cats is that not always do you get them as complete skeletons. You might get like a crappy bit of bone like this bit top left here, which is from Fishbourne Roman Palace. It's just a distal humerus. And if you've got a distal humerus from one place and a proximal femur from another, how do you start to explore cat size through time? So what we did was, one of my undergrad students, Teresa, she created a metrical baseline using a wildcat, which is the skeleton at the bottom, and then created log ratios to see how cat size has changed relative to that wildcat skeleton. So if I just pull up here, so the principle is that if a measurement that was being explored hit 0, that would suggest that it's the same size as this wildcat. And just from experience, if the measurement is kind of plus or minus 10, it generally suggests that we're looking at a different kind of species. So what we're seeing here is that some of these results have been confirmed by genetic analysis as well, which is being undertaken by colleagues at the University of Oxford. So all the ones that are in green, you can see have actually got genetic data confirming that they are wildcat. And then the ones that are in yellow have got data confirming that they are Libica, so the introduced domestic cat. And you can see that we've got some here that are green that kind of plot lower down, suggesting that they are kind of Libica size, so that they're domestic cat size, but actually have genetics suggesting that there might be some hybridization going on. So that's something that we'll drill down into more. But essentially what I wanted to show you with this graph is that from really, if we've got a situation where there are quite a lot of wild cats up until the end of the Roman period, we then see a drop in size to the 12th century. And it's from the 13th century, 13th, 15th century that we then start to see a real increase in cat size, to the point that we now, I mean, I measured my domestic cat, my dead cat, and he's huge. He looks like a wild cat. And I think what's happening is that the cats that we see today are often like really morbidly obese. They've been fed to the extent that they're certainly reaching their genetic potential in terms of size, to the extent that they now kind of look so large, they're like wild cats, but it's probably not great for their health. And this just reminds me of the kind of double burden of malnutrition that we see in humans as well, that we can look around the world and we can see that in the global north, that our cats are morbidly obese, which is not necessarily healthy. And in the global south, there are a lot of underweight cats, just like we have with the humans as well. And with that in mind, I wanted us to think then about what are the ethics of us feeding all of this fish and all of this protein to pet animals that are quite capable of hunting for themselves, rather than just bringing in the dead stuff and leaving it on my doorstep. You know, they could eat that as opposed to us getting quality protein for them. So, you know, what are the ethical implications of this? And also, what are the health implications for the things that we're doing to the animals that we purport to love? So this is a nice example that's actually from Henry Wellcome himself. So he really loved his cats. And we put this into our pitch. We went through the archive, and this is a letter that he left to his housekeeper, who was going to be looking after the cats. And he's leaving some very stern instructions about what they should be fed. And it's all really like high-end food. So on Saturdays, Fens will send a tin of salmon, which is to be given to the cats on a Sunday. It's talking about the lovely fishmongers that will come, and they'll provide liver and cod and all of these sorts of things. So he's really looking after his cats. But actually, all of the things that are in his list, if you feed them to the cats in such high frequencies, it can do quite a lot of damage as well. So there is a particular pathology known as feline odontoclastic resorptive lesions that you find in cats. It's a really, really nasty condition. It's not visible in the mouth because you can only pick it up on x-rays, where you can see that the crown from the inside is kind of being eaten away. Vets at the moment don't know the cause of it, but there is a suggestion that it's either age related, but perhaps also diet related. And so that's something that we're going to explore as well. You know, is this push towards feeding cats fish all the time actually a really bad choice for them? So that's something that we'll be able to get a deep time baseline on by x-raying all cat mandibles that we find, that we can also do isotope analysis on to see if there are any correlations. It doesn't necessarily mean cause, but it's a correlation. The second thing that this allows us to look at is really about, what I wanted to turn to now is the genetics. So looking at where we find those green dots, which are the sylvestris. You can see that after the Roman period, they're not there anymore. So it's possible that in 500 to 1000 AD, we've probably got a wild cat. I think it's in Lincolnshire. But beyond that, they're not in the record. Whereas in fact, in the Roman period, we have a lot of wildcats that we weren't expecting to find at all. So what does that actually mean? Well, it allows us to think about the changing Scottish, and I'm doing inverted commas around Scottish wildcat distribution, because they're Scottish now. And if we look over on the map on the left, and 1915, you know, we've got a few up in Scotland. In 1880, there's more of them. If we're back to 1850, their distribution is slightly more widespread. In the 1800s, they're much further south, they're into Wales. So if we then rolled that back and added in our archaeological data, we would see that actually wildcats are everywhere in the Iron Age and the Roman period. And it does seem that it is the introduction of the domestic cat that really did for the wildcat, because as soon as we see, if I just go back to this, as soon as those domestic cats are introduced, we start to see the wildcat kind of drop off in all locations, which is important when it comes to things like rewilding, because the International Union for the Conservation of Nature says that, you know, if we're to consider rewilding, we need to know the factors responsible for a species extinction. And I think it's getting to the point where we think we know what the factors are, that it's the domestic cat that is responsible for the wildcat's extinction. And therefore, all of these captive rewilding programs that are taking place, are they going to be completely futile whilst we have domestic cats absolutely everywhere? So it's something to think about, and we should get data, although the project's not necessarily about it, we'll get data that should be useful for considering these sorts of things. Let's go on to the final study, which is about zookeeping, past, present, and future. Because I think, you know, we've got the wildcats that are in zoos, and that's where that sign, "Please do not feed the animals," comes from. And there is a deep history of zookeeping in Britain, and I think actually we think we've got one of the earliest zoos at Fishbourne Roman Palace, because there's just so much crazy exotica that is represented in that assemblage. But I think the most famous things really kick in the medieval period. So for instance, Henry III, he had an elephant that was kept at the Tower of London, and we know something of what that elephant was fed, which was beef and red wine, which for the world's largest vegetarian is not a great diet. And it's not surprising that it died very, very quickly. But, you know, we then tend to think, oh, well, these medieval people, they were morons, so of course, what did they know? But you only need to look, you know, a few decades ago, and we were doing pretty similar things in chimpanzees' tea parties, where chimps, baby chimps, would be kind of wrestled from their mothers and taken into human homes to be fed human diets, which caused huge amounts of emotional distress and physical distress, because they were encouraged to walk upright like humans as well, and then fed things with, you know, buns and carbohydrates. So, you know, had we really progressed that much since the medieval period? But of course, we've got now all of these signs that say do not feed the animals, because we're kind of reassured by the zookeepers that they know best how to provision for their animals. And, you know, I think this is a really nice example. We know what pandas eat, right? We know that they eat bamboo. We're pretty confident about this, except that's not necessarily the case. What this panda is savaging here is a peafowl. And in fact, pandas will readily eat meat if they're given it, but they're seldom given it, because we all know that pandas eat bamboo. And I was talking to Andrew Kitchener about this, because he was overseeing the panda breeding program. And when he was asking them, you know, so are the pandas breeding? And they're like, no, they're not. And he's like, well, what are you feeding them? And they all fell off their chairs laughing, going, well, bamboo, of course, you moron. And he was like, well, you know, try giving them some meat, at which point they fell off their chairs even more. And he was explaining to me that why this happens is because in order to qualify for getting into a zoo, generally animals are kind of a bit endangered. And if they're endangered, the chances are that they've been pushed to the margins of the environments that they used to live in. And that's the case with pandas. They've been pushed to the extremes of the natural environments that pandas would live in. And they're essentially now eating a famine diet. And the problem with zoos is that they find the animals and then essentially replicate the famine diets, that these animals are just clinging on to survival around the edges. And that's the thing that gets replicated within zoos. So that's one of the things that we want to challenge through this as well. And I think that's where zoo archaeology and studying natural history collections might be helpful. It was something that dawned on me actually when I was working with Holly Miller, and that's Fraser Bowen, on the Fallow Deer project, when we were trying to create a new metrical baseline and also a dental aging method so that we could better understand fallow deer demographics. And so we were examining lots of modern collections of animals of known history. And one of the collections that we went to was the Natural History Museum in Paris, where they have fallow deer from the menagerie there, so the Paris Zoo. And we realized very quickly that although we had gone there to study the jaws of these animals, none of them could really be used in the dental aging system that we were using, because they were all disgusting. I mean, oh, look at that one, 1879 to 2-233. This is just gross. All of these deer have got the worst oral pathologies. They've got abscesses, they've got tooth loss, their teeth are worn down to roots. 1884 over on the right image there, there's just nothing left of them. And it was just like box after box. We were pulling out these skeletons and they all had the worst pathologies that I'd ever seen. So the graph that I've got down at the bottom, the first 4 columns show the Paris menageries and which ones have oral pathologies. So red is yes, and blue is no. And I think most of the no's were only because they were juveniles that had died at birth, right? So all of these deer were horribly pathological. And if we compare it to some of the archaeological assemblages, so Mallorca, that's a Roman site, Dudley Castle, Richard Thomas has worked on that. None of them had any oral pathologies. And Phoenix Park, which is a deer park in Ireland, in Dublin, you can see a very large sample size there with, I think, 1 individual that had some sort of oral pathology. So something horrible is happening to these deer. And it didn't get better through time. So from 1840 to 1879, we've got like 50% or 4, okay, terribly small sample sizes. But by the time that we're in 1911 to 1946, 3 of those 4 jaws, or individuals rather, had oral pathologies. So this is a really nice example of how zoos are not necessarily these kind of ideal environments for animal conservation. And we could have told that from the skeletons as well. So what this shows is the Phoenix Park male and female scapulae, the shoulder blade measurements, by comparison to the Paris menagerie scapular measurements. And what I've got them is split into males and females. And you should be able to see that the Paris males, actually, some of those scapulae are plotting down with the females, and the female Paris deer are like off the chart. And I now have in my database hundreds and hundreds and thousands of metrics of fallow deer, and these Paris deer are the smallest in the entire data set. So clearly something is going on here. And you know, if we were to look at these data, this would be like an extreme, if this was an archaeological collection, we would be suggesting that this is an extreme form of domestication with diminution and pathologies taking place. So again, something that we want to be looking at. And it was that really sparked my interest in thinking, like, you know, we could be doing a lot more in terms of investigating zoo history, because there are so many books out there devoted to zoo history. There are books exploring particular zoos, there's historical approaches to zoos in general, but they're all based on documentary records and what people are saying. Whereas in fact, what exists out there are all of these archives of zoo animal skeletons that have been completely untouched. And the way that I think about these boxes, when I see shelf after shelf of zoo animals and their skeletons in boxes, as I see them almost as like manuscripts or books that could be taken off and written or translated. I see them as documents that are just waiting to be explored. And so that's something that we're going to be doing as part of this project, is really writing zoo history from the perspective of the animal, because that's not something that's been done before. And we do have the potential very often, particularly at places like the National Museums Scotland, where they do have collections of zoo animals tied into life/autopsy reports. So we can get a sense of what those animals were behaving like, but also tie that in with the skeletal remains. So this is a skull of Brutus the lion. He died in 1923. And you can see the state of poor Brutus. He's got heavily broken and decayed and worn teeth. There's tooth loss. He's got abscesses and huge amounts of dental calculus that shouldn't be there for carnivores. So if we married that with some metrical analysis and also isotope analysis to try and do full suite analysis of these individuals and really write osteobiographies, which is not something that has traditionally been done for animal remains. It's the domain of human remains. So I think there's potential for us to do that to animals, and so start to write these lived experiences of these animals, but from the animal's perspective. And we do have some archaeological specimens. So this 14th century lion skull that was recovered from the Tower of London, Andrew Kitchener worked on that. And you can see that, you know, we were talking about how the Tower of London elephant died really quick. And maybe that's why this lion has such great teeth. But if you compare this lion on the left's teeth with Brutus's teeth, you can see are completely worn down. Maybe those medieval folk weren't quite so bad at looking after their lions after all. But I think what we need to do is really explore what these animals' diets should be, perhaps by looking at broader natural history collections. So what we've got over on the right here is a skull from a wild animal that was caught around the same time as Brutus was dying. And that is kind of before the period of sort of human damage to the environment, and before all of these animals were pushed to the margins of their environment. So one of the things that we want to do is work particularly with natural history collections, and one of our partners is the Powell-Cotton Museum, which is this insane but brilliant but weird but disgusting collection of taxidermy and skins and remains that Percy Powell-Cotton kind of blew off the face of the planet in the early 1900s, so that he could bring the animals of the world to the people of Kent and put them all on display. So here's just one of the kind of displays that are there of all of the heads and trophies that were taxidermied and brought. So what we're seeing here, you know, as much as this kind of collecting would be completely unthinkable and unethical today, what it has inadvertently done is preserved a kind of snapshot of biological diversity from a couple of hundred years ago that we can now use to see what, you know, a lion diet might have looked like and what a lion in its prime should look like, that we can then compare with the collections that we have from museums, so that potentially we can start to have a better baseline that is not kind of reconstructing marginal environments, but actually premium environments of some of these animals. So to wrap this up then, let's bring this to some conclusions. What we're really trying to do is look at this kind of feeding, or particularly commensalism, as a way to think about the drivers and consequences of our human behavior that is all about kind of feeding animals. We want to think about whether really we should be thinking about domestication as something that happened a long, long time ago, you know, in the far forgotten past, or whether it's something that has continued to the present and is actually accelerating now, as we all have this kind of deep need to reconnect with nature. And as we do so, we're kind of, it's slipping from our fingertips because every single one of our actions is destroying it. So, you know, is that something that we can explore? And I should say, I'm not confident that, you know, this negative is necessarily the conclusion that we'll reach, but it's kind of where I'm at right now, is thinking that maybe we are not good as a species, but could be proven wrong. And then really, I want to use these kind of zooarchaeological techniques and these osteobiographical techniques to break ground in an area that's really traditionally been dominated by historians, particularly zoo historians, because if we can do that and start to tell these animal histories from an animal's perspective, I think it has, yeah, the potential to open up huge narratives around our understanding of human-animal relationships, whether it's in terms of zoos, but also, you know, that Powell-Cotton collection that has been presented as the history of Percy Powell-Cotton, and the animals in that collection are the truly silent partners, and I'd quite like to be able to tell their stories as well. And I feel that if we look at Powell-Cotton and some of these ancient specimens, not necessarily archaeological specimens, but ancient ones, that we might have the ability to get baseline data to develop diets that are more appropriate for zoo animals, so that those animals that were blown off the face of the planet, it wasn't in the end a complete waste of their lives, that potentially these animals that died 200 years ago might help us to halt extinctions in the present. And so with that, I will leave it and try to stop sharing my screen. Stop. There we go.